This court will now come to order. So you, Mr. Smith, are the plaintiff, and you, Miss Jones, are the defendant. Mr. Smith, you may proceed. Please share your complaint.
Thank you, Your Honor. I fell in love with Carol 5 years ago, and last Christmas I proposed to her on bent knee at her parents', Your Honor, which I had been saving up, at her parents' house. I gave a diamond engagement ring worth $6,000, which I had been saving up to buy for 3 years, all my savings, Your Honor. We were supposed to get married over Labor Day weekend, but she canceled the wedding 2 weeks before and said that she did not love me anymore. And yes, Your Honor, it's very tragic for me, very upset over this. A lot of thought went in this, and bent knee at her parents' house was a lot, so. Anyways, canceled the wedding before, and she said she did not love me and did not want to marry me. I asked for my engagement ring back, and she refused to give it back to me, Your Honor, and henceforth, I have a restraining order on her.
Wow. So you think Miss Jones should return the ring since she broke off the engagement and canceled the wedding?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ooh, well, let's now hear from the defendant, Miss Jones. Mr. Smith has said that you have refused to return the ring after you broke off the engagement and canceled the wedding. Why did you keep the ring?
Well, I'm going to tell my side of the story now. So my father paid over $10,000 for the wedding and my dress. The money is non-refundable. I'm going to sell the ring and pay him back for the money he spent.
I see. But it was you who canceled the wedding, Miss Jones, and not Mr. Smith. So why did you do that? You had been dating Mr. Smith for 5 years, and you accepted the engagement ring from him.
Your Honor, 2 weeks before the wedding, I found out that my fiance, Mr. Smith, had been having an affair with a friend of mine for the last 2 years. When confronted with this, he told me that he could see no problem with this and said that he liked an open marriage. Apparently didn't want to ask me before he put the ring on my finger either. So I immediately canceled the wedding.
Well, jury, how many of you would rule in favor of the plaintiff? Please raise your hands. How many of you would rule in favor of the defendant, Miss Jones?
Thank you.
You may keep the ring. Court is adjourned. Thank you, guys. And I especially want to thank Mark because it's totally against his character to play that part. Julie knows that. Well, anyway, there are two sides to every story, as we know, but sometimes we forget that and have to be reminded again. Something that can seem so clear, and you think, well, isn't it obvious? Well, no, not always. There's more to the story than meets your appearances. So we do this consciously all the time. We make judgments about people or about situations, and it's usually subconscious, and it may have something to do with our past experience or just memories of other people's experience and how they affect us. So I grew up in a very small town in Kansas, and there was less than 1,000 people. It was a very, most everybody who lived there was white Protestant. We had a few Catholics, but not even many of them. We had a Hispanic family that lived there that were Catholic, but there were no black people in my hometown. But one day, we were all in church. It was a Sunday, Methodist church. I'm singing in the choir, and in walks a black man. And he sits down about midway down the rows, and everybody turned around and looked at him. Now, I have to say, this is the first black man that had ever come to our church. Well, he had moved to our town just that week before. And people were shocked. They didn't know what to do. It's not that the people were bad people. Some of those people had never seen a black person. And I was one of them. I was, I think, about 12 years old at the time. But as I watched this all unfold, people were not friendly. They would not go up to him and talk to him. And regardless of, the fact that he was different, and I felt badly. His name was Daniel. And I often think about Daniel today and what he went through being judged primarily because of the color of his skin. And who knows what Daniel had to offer in terms of the gifts that he had to give, the experiences that he'd had, his life and what he could have shared with all of us. So it was obviously a gift that we chose not to receive because of making a judgment. There was a 6-year-old boy that came home from school and with a note from his teacher, and his teacher had written out that the little boy was stupid and should be withdrawn from school. This was Thomas Edison. Now, my father went through something very similar. In the 6th grade, he was told by his teacher that he was dumb and that he would never make anything of himself in life. Now, what a thing to say to a child, to pin that on them and give them that affirmation for the rest of their lives. And for me, when I was 16 years old, I went to my guidance counselor in high school. I went to obviously a very small high school. And I talked to him about going to college, and he said, well, looking at your grades from last year, I really don't think it's advisable for you to consider that. He said, maybe you should really consider a trade school. Well, the truth is that he did not know or ask anything about my sophomore year in high school, which at that time I had been taken by my mother. My parents had divorced. My mother moved us to South Dakota to live with my aunt and uncle. My mother and I slept in the same bed. I wore boys' clothes because my mother worked in a men's store and she couldn't afford to buy clothes anyplace else. So my whole life was turned upside down my sophomore year in high school. And I didn't care about anything. I didn't study. I was acting out, which, happens sometimes when kids are frustrated and angry, but they can't share that with their parents. So anyway, the guidance counselor didn't ask about my grades and why they were so bad. They were basically C's and D's. So anyway, but thank goodness Thomas Edison and my father and I did not listen to the people who judged us. And everything worked out well, and all of us have been pretty darn successful. Have you ever been unfairly judged? Raise your hands if you've ever felt unfairly judged by somebody in your life. Most all of us have at one time or another. Some of us have been judged and didn't know it. Well, judgment isn't always in the form of criticism. The other form of judgment is if people are constantly approving of you, that is another form of judgment, because if you constantly are being told that people approve of you, you can turn around and end up trying to earn approval from people to prove to yourself that you are worthy. So that's not a good thing, because people's ideas about you change, and different people have different ideas. So you should never pin your self-worth to someone else's judgment of you. Comparisons are also part of judgment. If you had a brother or sister, were you ever compared with your siblings? You know, were you told, oh, I wish you were more like your brother? Or, you know, your sister Sue, she always makes better grades than you do. Why can't you make better grades? So comparison is another form of judgment. Now, what does the Bible have to say about judgment? In the Old Testament, believe it or not, there are a lot of passages. We hear about the judgment of God in the Old Testament, but there are really a lot of Bible verses that talk about God does not judge as man does, based on appearances. But instead, he sees the heart of people. He sees the heart. And of course, Jesus, one of the most famous quotes by him in John 7:24, is, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." So what is right judgment? Well, Charles Fillmore, in the Revealing Word, which is the other book, we've got the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, and then we have the Revealing Word, which is much smaller. But in there he says, judgment is a faculty of the mind that can be exercised in two ways, from sense perception or spiritual understanding, which is what we were talking about in the Daily Word today. Spiritual understanding, spiritual discernment. If its actions are based on sense perception, its conclusions are fallible and often condemnatory. If based on spiritual understanding, they are safe. And later he writes specifically about spiritual discernment, and he says, right judgment is seen through the heart into others' hearts. Probably the most well-known story in the Bible about judgment is the story of King Solomon and the two mothers that came to him with the baby. And what had happened, of course, is that the two women both had babies that had been born recently. And during the night, one of the women rolled over and her baby was suffocated. So she took the other woman's baby, and they went to King Solomon and said, this is my baby, no, this is my baby. So they were arguing, and King Solomon said, well, I have a very simple way of handling this. I'll just split the baby in two, and then you can both have half. Well, one woman said, no, please, you can't do that. Please let the child live. Let her have the baby. But please, I love him. Let him live. Well, the other one said, yeah, go ahead and split the baby. Neither of us will get him. So what do you think Solomon did? Yeah, I mean, really, that's what love is all about. And he knew right then whose baby that was. That is a good example of right judgment. Now let's take this a little deeper. In the book Count Your Blessings, the author talks about how we're all mirrors for each other, right? So in other words, if you look at someone and you're thinking to yourself how selfish they are, well, you have that same selfishness within yourself. Because we can't identify something in someone else unless we've got it in ourselves as well. So whatever you are looking at someone and thinking in your heart, in your mind, you have that same trait. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your neighbor or somebody you work with, that you have the same traits you may be condemning them for. Jesus put it this way: "Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye?" Our perceptions are faulty. We can only see so clearly about something. There's always the other story. We can't give power to our perceptions because they're not stable. They change. They're incomplete. This is when we need to turn to the truth principles. Principle would tell us that God is present in all situations and God is working for us, not against us, and that things that happen are for us and not to us. This is not an easy teaching, and we talked about this in the Eye of the Storm when we had the classes on that. And it's difficult to follow that because it requires of us to see a perspective that's higher than and may challenge us in ways that we've not been challenged before. Whenever somebody comes to us and says, well, they're upset with us about something, and generally when somebody is judging us, it's about them more so than us, because here again, we project onto others what's going on within ourselves. So unless they're your boss, and then you better listen to what their expectations and what they're judging you about. But other times, it's really maybe more about projection and unmet needs. Unmet needs. So in other words, it's not about me. But if we get upset and we start getting defensive, that makes it about us. So it's how we react to that situation that's important. So if somebody approaches you and says, you know, I really don't like the way you did that presentation or whatever, rather than getting defensive, say, tell me more. Tell me more. And listen. That's all you have to do. So, asking that person to tell you more gives you a learning opportunity, and it gives them a chance to share how they're feeling, what's going on within them, and maybe they'll come to more clarity themselves. You should have a handout, and that handout is really helpful to you in situations if you are judging someone or if they are judging you. And the top thing, of course, is realizing that you have the same characteristic within yourself. And finding out what that unmet need is, whether it's yours or somebody else's. And approaching the person directly. And seeing from the perspective that something happens for you and not to you. And it's about coming to a greater awareness of your own needs and taking responsibility for your experience in life. Well, we're going to go into meditation here in a moment, and we're going to take this teaching a little bit deeper. And I've asked Elliot not to play during that, but I'm still going to ask Olivia to sing, so